Imagine standing on the walls of the greatest fortress city in the ancient world, watching your enemies sail away in defeat after 10 long years of war. Imagine the relief, the celebration, the tears of joy as you see their black ships disappearing over the horizon. Now imagine discovering, in the smoking ruins of your city just hours later, that everything you witnessed was a lie. The greatest military deception in human history. This is the story of Troy and the wooden horse that brought down an empire. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Trojan plain as King Priam of Troy climbed the worn stone steps to the highest tower of his citadel. His weathered hands gripped the ancient stones as he gazed out at a sight that should have filled his heart with joy, but instead left him with an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. The Greek camp, which had sprawled like a festering wound across the beaches of Troy for 10 brutal years, was gone. The thousands of black ships that had darkened their shores were nowhere to be seen. Only trampled earth, scattered debris, and the smoldering remains of countless campfires marked where the greatest army in the ancient world had made their stand. But there, standing alone on the empty plain, like a monument to war itself, was something that made Priam's blood run cold. A massive wooden horse, easily 30 feet tall, its polished surface gleaming in the morning light. Its craftsmanship was extraordinary, every plank perfectly fitted, every joint seamlessly sealed. The creature stood on 4 powerful legs, its neck arched proudly, its wooden eyes seeming to stare directly at the walls of Troy with an intelligence that made the old king shiver despite the warm Mediterranean sun. To understand the true magnitude of what was about to unfold, we must journey back to the very beginning of this epic tale, to a wedding that would spark the most famous war in ancient history. High on Mount Olympus, the gods were celebrating the marriage of Peleus and Thetis, a union that would eventually produce the legendary warrior Achilles. But one goddess had not been invited to this divine celebration: Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. Furious at this slight, Eris appeared at the wedding feast uninvited, carrying with her a golden apple inscribed with the words, "To the fairest." She rolled this apple across the banquet table, where it came to rest before 3 of the most powerful goddesses in the Greek pantheon: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each goddess claimed the apple as rightfully hers, and their argument grew so heated that Zeus himself feared to judge between them. Instead, the king of the gods chose a mortal to make this impossible decision: Paris, a prince of Troy who was renowned for his fairness and beauty. The 3 goddesses appeared before the young prince, each offering him a bribe for his favor. Hera promised him power and dominion over vast kingdoms. Athena offered him wisdom beyond all mortals and victory in every battle. But Aphrodite made an offer that the young prince could not refuse. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy his beloved city. For the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, queen of Sparta and wife of King Menelaus. When Paris traveled to Sparta on a diplomatic mission, Aphrodite fulfilled her promise, causing Helen to fall desperately in love with the Trojan prince. Together, they fled to Troy, taking with them not only Helen's heart, but also a substantial portion of Menelaus's treasure. The abduction of Helen, or her willing elopement, depending on which version of the story you believe, provided the perfect pretext for a war that had been brewing for years. The Greek city-states had long eyed Troy's strategic position controlling the entrance to the Black Sea and the lucrative trade routes that flowed through the Dardanelles. Troy's wealth was legendary, built on generations of taxing merchant ships and controlling the flow of goods between Europe and Asia. Menelaus called upon the oath that all of Helen's suitors had sworn years earlier to defend whichever man she chose as her husband. This oath, known as the Oath of Tyndareus, bound the greatest heroes and kings of Greece to come to Menelaus's aid. Soon, the largest military expedition in Greek history was assembling. Leading this vast coalition was Menelaus's brother, Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae, whose ambitions extended far beyond simply retrieving his brother's wife. The Greek fleet that set sail for Troy was a sight to behold. Over 1,000 ships carrying nearly 100,000 warriors, the largest military force the Mediterranean world had ever seen. Among them sailed legendary heroes whose names would echo through history. Achilles, the nearly invincible warrior whose only weakness was his heel. Ajax, a giant of a man whose strength was matched only by his courage. Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, whose intelligence would prove crucial to the war's ultimate outcome. Diomedes, the fierce warrior who had once wounded gods themselves, and many others whose deeds would be sung by bards for generations. But Troy was no ordinary city, and the Trojans were no ordinary people. Their city was protected by walls that seemed to touch the sky itself, built by the gods Apollo and Poseidon in ages past. These walls were so massive and well constructed that they had never been breached by enemy forces. The city's defenders were led by Hector, Paris's older brother and perhaps the greatest warrior of his generation. Where Paris was known for his beauty and his skill with a bow, Hector was renowned for his prowess with sword and spear, his tactical brilliance, and above all, his unwavering devotion to his city and his people. Under Hector's leadership, Troy's defenders included warriors from across Asia Minor and beyond. The Trojans had called upon their allies, and they responded in force. From the Amazon queens came Penthesilea with her warrior women. From Ethiopia came Memnon, son of the dawn goddess, leading his dark-skinned warriors. The Lycians sent their finest soldiers under the command of Sarpedon and Glaucus. These diverse forces, united in their determination to defend Troy, would prove more than a match for the Greek invaders. When the Greek fleet finally arrived at Troy's shores, both sides expected a quick resolution to the conflict. The Greeks, confident in their numbers and the righteousness of their cause, believed they would storm the city within months. The Trojans, protected by their mighty walls and inspired by their heroic leaders, were equally confident that they could drive off the invaders. Neither side could have imagined that they were embarking on a war that would consume an entire generation and become the stuff of legend. The early years of the war were marked by a series of epic duels and battles that would be remembered for millennia. The Greeks established their camp on the beaches, dragging their ships onto the sand and building a fortified position from which to launch their attacks. But Troy's walls proved impregnable, and what had been planned as a quick siege turned into a grinding war of attrition. The conflict seesawed back and forth with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Greeks controlled the sea and could prevent supplies from reaching Troy by water, but the city's land routes remained open, allowing food and reinforcements to flow in from the vast hinterland of Asia Minor. Meanwhile, the Trojans could not break the Greek beachhead, despite launching numerous sorties from their gates. Individual combats between champions became the stuff of legend. Hector and Ajax fought to a draw in a duel that lasted from dawn to dusk. Paris and Menelaus met in single combat to settle their dispute over Helen, But when Paris began to lose, Aphrodite spirited him away in a cloud of mist, leaving the issue unresolved. Diomedes rampaged across the battlefield with such fury that he wounded both Aphrodite and Ares when the gods themselves intervened in the fighting. But it was the wrath of Achilles that would define the war's middle period and nearly bring Greek victory within reach. When Agamemnon dishonored Achilles by taking away his war prize, the beautiful Briseis, the greatest Greek warrior withdrew from the fighting in a rage. Without Achilles and his feared Myrmidons, the Greek forces began to suffer defeat after defeat. Hector pushed the Greeks back to their very ships, threatening to burn their fleet and trap the entire army in Asia. Desperate to lure Achilles back into the fight, his beloved companion Patroclus donned Achilles' armor and led the Myrmidons into battle. The ruse worked initially, as the Trojans fell back in terror, thinking that Achilles himself had returned to the fight. But Hector soon realized the deception and killed Patroclus in single combat, stripping away Achilles' divine armor as a trophy. The death of Patroclus transformed Achilles' anger into something far more dangerous, a grief-fueled rage that would brook no obstacle. Thetis, his sea goddess mother, commissioned new armor from Hephaestus himself, armor so magnificent that it seemed to burn with its own inner fire. When Achilles finally returned to battle, his fury was terrible to behold. He carved through the Trojan ranks like a force of nature, driving them back to their walls and filling the river Scamander with so many corpses that the river god himself rose up in protest. The climax of Achilles' rampage came when he finally faced Hector in single combat beneath the walls of Troy. The entire city watched from the ramparts as their greatest champion faced the Greek war machine. Hector, knowing he was likely going to his death, fought with desperate courage, but even his legendary skill could not match Achilles in his divine armor. When Hector fell, pierced through the throat by Achilles' spear, it seemed as though Troy's fate was sealed. But Achilles' triumph was short-lived. Paris, guided by Apollo, managed to strike the one vulnerable spot on the Greek hero's body. His heel, the only place where his mother's protective magic had not reached. As Achilles lay dying on the battlefield, the balance of the war shifted once again. Without their greatest warrior, the Greeks found themselves facing a resurgent Troy under new leadership. The death of Achilles marked the beginning of the war's final phase, a period that would see both sides employing increasingly desperate strategies. The Greeks welcomed new allies, including the young Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, who proved to be nearly as formidable as his father. The Trojans, meanwhile, received their own reinforcements, including the Amazon queen Penthesilea and Memnon of Ethiopia, both of whom briefly turned the tide in Troy's favor before falling to Greek champions. As the war dragged into its 10th year, both sides were exhausted. The cream of Greek youth lay buried in foreign soil, while Troy's population had been decimated by years of warfare and siege. Food was becoming scarce within the city, and many of Troy's allies had begun to waver in their support. It was clear to the leaders on both sides that the conflict could not continue much longer in its current form. It was at this crucial moment that Odysseus, the craftiest of all the Greek leaders, proposed a radical new strategy. If Troy could not be taken by force, perhaps it could be taken by guile. The idea that would eventually become the Trojan Horse began as a desperate gamble by a war-weary army, but it would evolve into the most famous military deception in history. The plan that Odysseus conceived was audacious beyond belief. The Greeks would pretend to abandon their siege and sail away, leaving behind a massive wooden horse as an offering to the gods. Hidden inside this horse would be a select group of their finest warriors, who would emerge at night to open Troy's gates from within. The success of the plan depended entirely on convincing the Trojans that the Greeks had truly given up, and that the horse was a genuine religious offering rather than a military weapon. The construction of the horse itself was a masterwork of ancient engineering. Epeius, the finest craftsman in the Greek army, was chosen to design and build the massive structure. Working with a team of skilled carpenters and aided by Athena herself, according to legend, Epeius created a hollow wooden horse large enough to conceal 30 of Greece's finest warriors, while still appearing solid and genuine from the outside. The horse was built from the finest timber the Greeks could salvage from their ships and siege equipment. Every joint was carefully fitted and sealed to prevent any sound from escaping. Ventilation was cleverly concealed within the horse's design, allowing the hidden warriors to breathe without being detected. Most crucially, the entrance to the horse's hollow interior was concealed so skillfully that even close inspection would not reveal its presence. While the horse was being constructed, the Greeks began the elaborate deception that would sell their ruse to the Trojans. They broke down their camp, burned their siege equipment, and loaded their ships as if preparing for a permanent departure. To make their retreat appear genuine, they even left behind some of their less valuable possessions and equipment, scattered about the campsite as if abandoned in haste. The selection of the warriors who would hide inside the horse was crucial to the plan's success. Odysseus chose men not just for their fighting ability, but for their discipline and mental toughness. They would need to remain absolutely silent and motionless for hours, possibly days, while hidden in the cramped confines of the wooden structure. Among those chosen were Menelaus himself, Ajax the Lesser, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, and of course Odysseus, who would lead the group. On the appointed night, the chosen warriors climbed into the horse through its hidden entrance. The opening was then sealed so carefully that no trace of it remained visible from the outside. Meanwhile, the rest of the Greek army boarded their ships and sailed away into the darkness, but they did not go far. Following Odysseus's plan, they sailed only to the nearby island of Tenedos, where they would wait for the signal to return. As dawn broke over the Trojan plain, the sight that greeted the city's watchmen was almost too good to believe. The Greek camp was empty, their ships were gone, and only the mysterious wooden horse remained as evidence that the siege had ever happened. The news spread through the city like wildfire. After 10 years of war, the Greeks had finally given up and gone home. The gates of Troy, which had remained barred for a decade, swung open as citizens poured out onto the plain to see for themselves that their long nightmare was finally over. Children who had never played outside the city's walls ran laughing through the abandoned Greek camp. Women who had not seen their husbands except between battles embraced them in the open air. Old men wept with joy at the thought that they would live to see peace again. But even in their joy, the Trojans were puzzled by the massive wooden horse that dominated the empty battlefield. What was its purpose? Why had the Greeks left it behind? Some suggested it was an offering to Poseidon, meant to ensure the Greeks' safe passage home across the wine-dark sea. Others thought it might be a tribute to Troy itself, acknowledging the city's invincibility. Still others wondered if it might be some kind of trap, though they could not imagine how a simple wooden statue could pose any threat. The debate over what to do with the horse divided the Trojans into several camps. Some, led by the priest Laocoon, argued that it should be destroyed immediately. I fear the Greeks, even when bearing gifts, Laocoon declared, coining a phrase that would echo through history. He urged his countrymen to burn the horse or drag it into the sea, warning that any gift from their enemies was likely to bring nothing but trouble. Others, however, saw the horse as a sign of divine favor and argued that it should be brought into the city as a trophy of their victory. Chief among these was Priam himself, who had grown weary of war and wanted nothing more than to believe that peace had finally come to his city. The old king looked at the magnificent craftsmanship of the horse and saw in it a fitting memorial to Troy's triumph over the greatest army ever assembled. The debate was interrupted by the arrival of Sinon, a Greek warrior who had apparently been left behind by his fleeing comrades. Dragged before the Trojan leaders, Sinon wove a tale that was both believable and perfectly calculated to convince the Trojans to bring the horse within their walls. He claimed that he had been selected as a human sacrifice to ensure the Greeks' safe passage home, but had escaped at the last moment when his guards became distracted by their preparations for departure. According to Sinon's story, the Greeks had finally decided to abandon their siege after the gods had repeatedly shown their displeasure with the enterprise. The wooden horse, he explained, was indeed an offering to Athena, built to appease the goddess and ensure safe passage across the treacherous seas. The horse had been made deliberately large and impressive so that the Trojans would not be able to bring it inside their city, thus preventing them from gaining Athena's favor for themselves. This clever reverse psychology worked perfectly on the proud Trojans. If the Greeks had built the horse specifically to keep it out of Troy, then bringing it into the city would not only serve as a trophy of victory, but would also transfer the gods' favor from the Greeks to themselves. The more Sinon insisted that the horse must not be brought into the city, the more determined the Trojans became to do exactly that. The priest Laocoon made one final attempt to warn his people, dramatically hurling his spear at the side of the horse. The spear struck with a hollow thud that should have revealed the horse's true nature, but at that crucial moment, the gods themselves seemed to intervene against Troy. Two enormous sea serpents emerged from the waves and attacked Laocoon and his sons, crushing them to death in their coils before disappearing back into the sea. To the Trojans, this could only be interpreted as divine punishment for Laocoon's impiety in attacking what was clearly a sacred offering. All doubts about the horse's legitimacy vanished in the face of what seemed to be clear divine judgment. The decision was made. The horse would be brought into Troy and installed in the temple of Athena as a symbol of the city's victory and the gods' favor. Moving the massive horse into the city presented its own challenges. The wooden structure was too large to fit through Troy's gates, which meant that a section of the city's walls had to be dismantled to allow its passage. Even this seemed auspicious to the Trojans. If the horse was too large for their gates, it proved that the Greeks could never have intended it as a weapon of war. The entire population of Troy turned out to help move the horse into their city. Ropes were attached to its legs, and hundreds of men, women, and children pulled together to drag the massive structure through the breach in their walls. It was back-breaking work that took most of the day, but the Trojans attacked the task with the enthusiasm of people celebrating their liberation from a decade of warfare. As evening fell, the horse finally stood in the great square before Athena's temple, towering over the celebrating crowds like a monument to Trojan endurance and Greek failure. Torches were lit throughout the city, wine flowed freely, and the sounds of music and laughter echoed off the ancient walls. For the first time in 10 years, the gates of Troy stood open, and the guards who had maintained their vigilant watch for so long finally relaxed their vigil. Hidden inside the horse, the Greek warriors endured their own private torment. Cramped in the darkness, barely able to breathe, they listened to the sounds of celebration outside and waited for their moment to strike. Hours passed like days as they fought off claustrophobia, muscle cramps, and the overwhelming urge to cough or shift position. One sound, one moment of inattention, and their mission would end in disaster. As the night wore on, the sounds of celebration gradually subsided. The wine-soaked Trojans began to stumble home to their beds, exhausted by their day of labor and their night of festivity. Guards who should have been watching the walls were drunk or asleep. The city that had maintained perfect discipline for 10 years of siege finally let down its guard on the very night when vigilance was most crucial. Deep in the night, when Troy lay wrapped in the sleep of the innocent, Odysseus carefully opened the concealed entrance to the horse. One by one, the Greek warriors dropped silently to the ground, their weapons ready, their hearts pounding with anticipation and fear. After 10 years of frontal assault, the fate of Troy would finally be decided by stealth and cunning, rather than strength and courage. The Greeks moved through the darkened city like shadows, their intimate knowledge of Troy's layout, gained through years of observation from their camp, serving them well. Their first objective was the gates, which had to be opened to allow the main Greek army to enter the city. A small group of warriors made their way to the great gate that faced the sea, while others prepared to seize key positions throughout the city. Meanwhile, Sinon had slipped away from his Trojan captors and made his way to the highest tower of the city. There, he lit a beacon fire that served as a signal to the Greek fleet waiting at Tenedos. Seeing the flame, the Greeks immediately set sail for Troy, their ships cutting through the dark waters toward their ultimate destiny. The opening of Troy's gates was accomplished with surprising ease. The guards, drunk on wine and victory, were quickly overwhelmed by the silent Greek warriors. The massive bronze-reinforced wooden barriers that had protected the city for 10 years swung open at last, and the greatest fortress in the ancient world lay defenseless before its enemies. The Greek army poured through the open gates like a flood, their war cries shattering the peaceful night as they spread throughout the city. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre, as the sleeping Trojans were caught completely unprepared for the assault. Men died in their beds, women and children were dragged from their homes, and the streets ran red with blood. Some Trojan warriors managed to organize pockets of resistance. Hector's brothers, Deiphobus and Helenus, fought desperately to rally their people, but they were vastly outnumbered and caught completely by surprise. The palace guards made a heroic stand at the gates of Priam's citadel, but they were overwhelmed by the Greek assault. King Priam himself met his end at the altar of Zeus in his own palace, cut down by Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, in an act of brutal vengeance. The old king, who had ruled Troy through its greatest days and its darkest hours, died seeing his beloved city consumed by flames and his people scattered to the winds. The sack of Troy was total and merciless. The Greeks, driven by 10 years of accumulated rage and frustration, showed no mercy to their enemies. The city's wealth, accumulated over centuries of trade and conquest, was divided among the victorious warriors. The women and children who survived the initial massacre were enslaved, destined to serve their conquerors in distant lands. Helen, the woman whose face had launched 1,000 ships and whose abduction had sparked the entire war, was finally reunited with her husband Menelaus. But the reunion was not the joyful reconciliation that might have been expected. Too much blood had been spilled, too many lives lost for such a simple ending. Some versions of the story suggest that Menelaus initially intended to kill his unfaithful wife, only to be overcome by her beauty once more. Others claim that Helen had been an unwilling captive all along, held in Troy against her will by the power of Aphrodite's magic. The destruction of Troy was so complete that the city would never recover its former glory. The great walls that had protected it for so long were torn down, The buildings were burned to the ground, and the very foundations were scattered. When later Greek colonists founded a new settlement on the site, it was a pale shadow of the mighty city that had once controlled the entrance to the Black Sea. But even as Troy burned, the seeds of Greek tragedy were being sown. The gods, who had watched the 10-year conflict with varying degrees of interest and involvement, were horrified by the sacrilege and brutality that marked the city's final hours. Greek warriors desecrated temples, murdered suppliants who had sought sanctuary at altars, and committed acts of violence that violated every law of civilized warfare. The punishment for these crimes would follow the Greeks home, ensuring that their victory would prove as costly as their long siege. Odysseus, the architect of Troy's destruction, would wander the Mediterranean for 10 years before reaching his home island of Ithaca. Agamemnon would be murdered by his wife and her lover upon his return to Mycenae. Many of the Greek ships would be wrecked in storms sent by angry gods, and many of the surviving warriors would find their kingdoms usurped by rivals who had remained safely at home. The story of the Trojan Horse became more than just a tale of military deception. It became a parable about the dangers of pride, the importance of vigilance, and the way that victory can be snatched from the jaws of defeat through cleverness and determination. The phrase, "beware of Greeks bearing gifts," entered the common vocabulary, serving as a warning about the need to look beyond surface appearances to understand true motivations. Archaeological evidence suggests that Troy was indeed destroyed by fire around 1180 BCE, during what historians call the Late Bronze Age collapse. While we cannot know for certain whether the specific details of Homer's account are historically accurate, the broad outlines of the story, a great city destroyed after a long siege, appear to have some basis in historical fact. The Trojan horse itself, whether it existed as described or was a poetic metaphor for some other form of deception, represents one of the most enduring symbols in Western culture. It has been depicted in countless works of art, referenced in literature from Virgil to Shakespeare to modern times, and continues to serve as a metaphor for hidden dangers and deceptive appearances. In our modern age of cyber warfare, the term Trojan horse has taken on new meaning, describing malicious computer programs that appear harmless but contain hidden destructive code. This modern usage demonstrates the continued relevance of the ancient story, showing how the fundamental human tendency to be deceived by attractive exteriors remains as relevant today as it was 3,000 years ago. The fall of Troy also marked the end of the heroic age in Greek culture, the passing of an era when gods walked among mortals and individual warriors could change the course of history through their personal prowess. The world that emerged from Troy's ashes would be more complex, more political, and more recognizably modern in its concerns and conflicts. For the Greeks themselves, the Trojan War became the defining moment of their cultural identity, the great shared experience that united the various city-states despite their frequent conflicts with one another. The heroes who fought at Troy became the ancestors that every Greek community claimed, and the stories of their deeds provided moral and practical lessons for subsequent generations. The tragedy of Troy lay not just in the city's destruction, but in the recognition that both sides had fought with honor and courage for causes they believed were just. Hector, the great Trojan hero, was mourned even by his Greek enemies as a worthy opponent who had died defending his home and family. The war had no clear heroes or villains, only human beings caught up in events larger than themselves, driven by forces, divine and human, that they could not fully understand or control. In the end, the wooden horse that stood in Troy's square for just one night became one of history's most powerful symbols precisely because it represented the complexity of human nature itself. Like the horse, we are all capable of concealing our true intentions behind attractive facades. Like the Trojans, we are all susceptible to being deceived by appearances, especially when those appearances conform to our deepest wishes and desires. The story reminds us that in warfare, as in life, victory often goes not to the strongest or the most courageous, but to the most cunning and adaptable. The Greeks won their great war not through 10 years of heroic combat, but through a single night of deception. Sometimes the greatest achievements require us to think beyond conventional approaches and find new ways to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. As King Priam had feared when he first saw the horse standing alone on the empty plain, some gifts are too dangerous to accept, no matter how beautiful or tempting they might appear. The Trojans' fatal mistake was not in their courage or their military skill, but in their inability to imagine that their enemies might be clever enough to turn their own victory celebration into the instrument of their destruction. And so the great city of Troy, which had withstood 10 years of siege by the greatest army ever assembled, fell in a single night to 30 men hidden in a wooden horse. It remains one of history's greatest lessons in the power of human ingenuity, the dangers of overconfidence, and the eternal truth that in war, as in life, nothing is ever quite what it seems. But the story of the Trojan horse does not end with the flames consuming Troy's ancient walls. In many ways, the true tragedy was only beginning, as the gods' vengeance would follow the Greeks across the wine-dark sea, ensuring that their moment of triumph would be paid for with decades of suffering and loss. Among the first to feel divine retribution was Ajax the Lesser, one of the warriors who had hidden inside the wooden horse. During the sack of Troy, Ajax had committed an act so heinous that it shocked even his battle-hardened comrades. He had pursued Cassandra, Priam's prophetic daughter, into the temple of Athena, and violated her at the very altar of the goddess. This sacrilege against both human decency and divine law would not go unpunished. Cassandra herself was perhaps the most tragic figure in Troy's final hours. Blessed with the gift of prophecy, but cursed so that no one would ever believe her predictions. She had spent years warning her people about the disasters that awaited them. She had foreseen Paris's journey to Sparta and the war it would bring. She had predicted Hector's death and Troy's fall. She had even warned against bringing the wooden horse into the city, crying out that it was filled with armed men ready to destroy them all. But as always, her warnings were dismissed as the ravings of a madwoman. Now, as she was dragged away to become Agamemnon's concubine, Cassandra delivered one final prophecy that would prove all too accurate. She foretold that Agamemnon would die at the hands of his own wife, that his kingdom would be torn apart by civil war, and that the curse of the house of Atreus would continue to claim victims for generations to come. The Greek king laughed at her words, but within months he would discover the terrible truth of her predictions. The immediate aftermath of Troy's fall revealed the full extent of Greek brutality during the city's final hours. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, had not only killed the aged King Priam, but had hurled Hector's infant son Astyanax from the city's walls, ensuring that no male heir could ever rise to avenge Troy's destruction. Hector's wife Andromache, now widowed and childless, was claimed as Neoptolemus's prize, condemned to serve the son of the man who had killed her husband. The prophet Calchas, who had served the Greeks throughout the war, delivered a chilling warning as the army prepared to depart. The gods were angry, he declared, and the seas would not be safe for those who had defiled Troy's sacred places. He advised the leaders to remain in Troy for a full year, offering sacrifices and purifications to appease divine wrath. But the Greeks, drunk on victory and eager to return home with their plunder, largely ignored his counsel. The division of Troy's spoils became a source of immediate conflict among the Greek leaders. Helen, the cause of the entire war, was returned to Menelaus, but not without controversy. Many warriors argued that she should be executed for her role in causing so much death and destruction. Others claimed that she had been an unwilling victim of the gods' manipulations and deserved forgiveness. Menelaus himself seemed torn between love and rage, ultimately choosing to take his wife home, but never fully trusting her again. Agamemnon claimed Cassandra as his concubine, a decision that would prove fatal upon his return to Mycenae. The other Trojan women were distributed among the various Greek leaders according to their rank and contributions to the victory. Queen Hecuba, Priam's wife and mother of 19 children, was given to Odysseus, though she would never reach Ithaca alive. The elderly queen's suffering during Troy's final night had driven her to madness, and she would later transform into a fearsome hound, according to legend, still pursuing vengeance against her Greek captors. As the Greek fleet prepared to depart, omens began to appear that should have warned them of the disasters ahead. Birds of prey circled overhead in unusual patterns. The winds that had favored their arrival 10 years earlier now seemed to blow from every direction at once, making navigation treacherous. Most ominously, the sea itself seemed to have changed color, taking on a dark, almost black appearance that reminded veterans of the blood that had soaked Troy's streets. The first to depart was Nestor, the wise king of Pylos, whose age and experience had made him cautious about lingering near the ruins of Troy. His ships encountered relatively calm seas and favorable winds, allowing him to reach home safely with his share of Troy's treasure. But Nestor would live to regret his quick departure, as he would spend his final years haunted by the knowledge of what befell his less fortunate comrades. Diomedes, the fierce warrior who had wounded gods themselves during the siege, also managed to reach his homeland of Argos without incident. However, he found his kingdom in chaos, his wife having taken a lover during his long absence. Forced to flee his own land, Diomedes would eventually settle in Italy, founding new cities, but never again enjoying the power and prestige he had known before the war. The fate of Ajax the Greater, son of Telamon, illustrated the complex relationship between honor and pride that characterized the Greek heroes. When Achilles died, a contest was held to determine who would inherit his magnificent armor. The two leading candidates were Ajax and Odysseus, both of whom had distinguished themselves throughout the war. The army voted, and Odysseus won by a narrow margin, a decision that drove Ajax into a murderous rage. Feeling dishonored and betrayed by his comrades, Ajax planned to murder Odysseus, Agamemnon, and Menelaus in their sleep. But Athena, who favored Odysseus, drove Ajax temporarily insane, causing him to slaughter a flock of sheep instead, thinking they were his enemies. When dawn came and Ajax realized what he had done, his shame was so overwhelming that he fell on his own sword rather than face the mockery of his peers. The death of Ajax sent shockwaves through the Greek camp and served as a grim reminder that victory could not heal all wounds. The greatest warriors of their generation were beginning to turn on each other, suggesting that the curse of Troy might follow them even in triumph. Some of the more superstitious soldiers began to whisper that the wooden horse had brought not just Greek warriors into Troy, but also the seeds of their own destruction. Menelaus and Helen's journey home proved to be an epic in itself, taking them 8 years to complete due to adverse winds and divine interference. They were blown off course to Egypt, where they spent several years stranded, unable to find favorable winds to continue their voyage. During this time, their relationship slowly healed, though it would never return to its original innocence. The Helen who finally returned to Sparta was a changed woman, marked by years of war and tragedy, her legendary beauty tempered by sorrow and wisdom. But it was Odysseus who would face the greatest trials on his journey home, trials that would become the subject of their own epic tale. The king of Ithaca, whose cunning had made possible the victory at Troy, found himself the special target of Poseidon's wrath. The sea god who had helped build Troy's walls in ages past was enraged by the city's destruction and determined to punish those responsible. Odysseus's wanderings began almost immediately after leaving Troy. His small fleet was blown off course by supernatural storms, landing on strange shores inhabited by monsters and magical beings. On the island of the Lotus Eaters, some of his men consumed plants that made them forget their desire to return home, forcing Odysseus to drag them back to the ships by force. This was only the first of many trials that would test not just his physical courage, but his mental resilience and leadership abilities. The encounter with the Cyclops Polyphemus became one of the most famous episodes of Odysseus's journey. Trapped in the giant's cave with several of his men already devoured, Odysseus used his characteristic cunning to escape. He got Polyphemus drunk on wine, then blinded him with a heated stake while the giant slept. When Polyphemus called for help from his fellow Cyclopes, he could only say that nobody had hurt him, the false name Odysseus had cleverly given, so his kinsman assumed nothing was wrong and left him alone. However, Odysseus's pride ultimately betrayed him. As his ship sailed away from the island, he could not resist revealing his true name to the blinded giant, boasting of his victory. This act of hubris allowed Polyphemus, who was Poseidon's son, to call upon his father for vengeance. From that moment forward, Odysseus was doomed to wander the seas for 10 years, facing one supernatural trial after another. The witch Circe transformed half of Odysseus's crew into pigs before the hero forced her to reverse the spell. The sirens, whose song could drive men mad with desire, nearly lured his ship to destruction on the rocks. Scylla and Charybdis, the twin monsters who guarded a narrow strait, devoured 6 of his best men. Each encounter cost Odysseus followers, ships, and treasure, gradually whittling down his once proud fleet until he alone survived to reach Ithaca. Meanwhile, Agamemnon's homecoming provided a stark illustration of how victory in foreign wars could not guarantee security at home. During the 10 years of the Trojan War, his wife Clytemnestra had taken his cousin Aegisthus as her lover and co-conspirator. Their affair was motivated by more than simple lust. Clytemnestra had never forgiven Agamemnon for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia to ensure favorable winds for the voyage to Troy. When Agamemnon finally returned to Mycenae, he was accompanied by Cassandra and laden with Trojan treasure. Clytemnestra welcomed him with apparent joy, preparing a great feast to celebrate his victory. But as Agamemnon bathed after the long journey, she and Aegisthus struck, killing both the king and his prophetic concubine. Cassandra's final prophecy had come true. She had indeed seen her own death along with that of her captor. The murder of Agamemnon set in motion a cycle of vengeance that would consume his family for generations. His son Orestes, who had been away from Mycenae during the assassination, returned years later to avenge his father's death. Following the ancient law that demanded blood for blood, Orestes killed both his mother and her lover. But this act of justified vengeance brought down upon him the Furies, ancient goddesses who punished those who spilled kindred blood. The curse of the house of Atreus, which had begun with Agamemnon's father Atreus and his brother Thyestes, continued to claim victims. Atreus had killed Thyestes' children and served them to their father at a feast, a crime so heinous that it had cursed the entire bloodline. The Trojan War, rather than bringing glory and redemption to the family, had only added more layers to this ancient curse. The scattered remnants of the Greek army faced varying fates as they attempted to return to their homes and normal lives. Many found that a decade of absence had changed everything they had left behind. Sons had grown to manhood without knowing their fathers. Wives had remarried, believing themselves widowed. Kingdoms had been usurped by rivals or fallen into chaos. The warriors who had shared the glory of Troy's conquest found themselves strangers in their own lands. Some Greek survivors chose not to return home at all, instead founding new colonies in distant lands. These settlements, scattered across the Mediterranean, carried with them the memory of Troy and the lessons learned from its fall. They established new cities that would eventually grow into major centers of Greek civilization, spreading the culture and values that had triumphed at Troy throughout the ancient world. The Trojan survivors, meanwhile, faced their own epic journeys. Aeneas, one of the few Trojan nobles to escape the city's destruction, was destined by the fates to found a new Troy in a distant land. Carrying his aged father Anchises on his back and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand, Aeneas fled the burning city with a small band of followers. Aeneas's journey would eventually take him to Italy, where he would become the ancestor of the Roman people. This connection between Troy and Rome became a central element of Roman mythology, with the Romans claiming to be the rightful heirs of Troy's glory. In their telling, the destruction of Troy was not an end, but a beginning. The first chapter in Rome's destined rise to rule the known world. The transformation of the Trojan War from history into legend began almost immediately after the events themselves. Bards throughout the Greek world began composing songs about the heroes and their deeds, embellishing the facts with supernatural elements and divine interventions. These oral traditions were eventually collected and refined by poets like Homer, whose Iliad and Odyssey would become the foundational texts of Western literature. But even as the stories were being refined and polished for posterity, the real consequences of the war continued to unfold. The Bronze Age civilization that had produced Troy and Mycenae was collapsing. Victim to internal conflicts, natural disasters, and invasions by mysterious sea peoples, who may have included some of the displaced survivors of the Trojan War. The great palaces that had ruled the Greek world were abandoned or destroyed. The complex trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean civilizations were disrupted. Writing systems were lost, and much of the technological knowledge accumulated over centuries disappeared with the collapse of the palace bureaucracies that had preserved it. In this context, the Trojan War can be seen not just as a conflict between two cities, but as the climactic struggle of an entire era. The heroes who fought at Troy were the last representatives of an age of bronze weapons, palace-centered kingdoms, and direct divine intervention in human affairs. The world that emerged from the war's aftermath would be fundamentally different. Iron would replace bronze. Alphabetic writing would replace syllabic scripts, and new forms of political organization would emerge. The wooden horse itself became a powerful symbol that transcended its original military context. In Greek thought, it represented the triumph of intelligence over brute force, the power of deception over straightforward assault. The horse embodied the complexity of warfare itself, showing that victory often required not just courage and strength, but also cunning, patience, and the ability to think beyond conventional strategies. Later Greek philosophers would use the story of the Trojan horse to explore deeper questions about the nature of truth and appearance. If a wooden horse could conceal deadly warriors, what other deceptions might be hiding behind attractive facades? The story became a parable about the need for wisdom and discernment in navigating a world where things are rarely what they seem. The religious implications of the story were equally profound. The gods' punishment of the Greeks for their sacrilege at Troy demonstrated that even victory could not excuse violations of divine law. The lengthy sufferings of the Greek heroes on their homeward journeys served as a reminder that the gods demanded proper respect and behavior from mortals, regardless of their earthly achievements. Christian writers would later interpret the story allegorically, seeing in the Trojan horse a symbol of how sin enters the soul disguised as something attractive and desirable. The Trojans' fatal decision to bring the horse into their city became a metaphor for the way temptation overcomes human reason and leads to spiritual destruction. The story's influence extended far beyond literature and religion into the realm of military strategy and political theory. The concept of the Trojan horse became synonymous with any strategy that used deception to achieve what could not be accomplished through direct confrontation. Military commanders throughout history would study Odysseus's stratagem, looking for ways to apply its principles to their own campaigns. In the modern era, the Trojan horse concept has found new applications in technology and cyber warfare. Computer viruses that appear to be harmless programs while concealing destructive code are called Trojan horses, demonstrating the continued relevance of the ancient story. The fundamental human tendency to be deceived by appearances remains as problematic today as it was 3,000 years ago. The archaeological rediscovery of Troy in the 19th century by Heinrich Schliemann added new dimensions to the story's significance. The excavation of multiple layers of ancient cities at the site, traditionally identified as Troy, provided physical evidence that some version of the events described by Homer might actually have occurred. While scholars continue to debate the historicity of specific details, the archaeological record clearly shows that Troy was indeed destroyed by fire around the time traditionally assigned to the Trojan War. This archaeological evidence has sparked renewed interest in the story and its implications. Modern scholars have examined the tale from multiple perspectives: historical, literary, anthropological, and psychological, finding new layers of meaning in this ancient narrative. The story of the Trojan horse continues to yield insights into human nature, military strategy, political deception, and the complex relationship between myth and history. The enduring power of the Trojan horse story lies in its ability to speak to universal human experiences and concerns. Every generation finds new relevance in the tale of Troy's fall, seeing in it reflections of their own struggles with deception, pride, revenge, and the unintended consequences of victory. The wooden horse remains one of the most recognizable symbols in world culture, instantly understood across linguistic and cultural boundaries. As we stand in our own age, facing new forms of deception and hidden threats, the story of the Trojan horse serves as both warning and wisdom. It reminds us that our greatest vulnerabilities often lie not in our weaknesses, but in our strengths, in the very qualities that we take pride in. Troy's walls were impregnable, but they could not protect against the enemy that the Trojans themselves welcomed inside. The legacy of that fateful night when 30 Greek warriors emerged from a wooden horse continues to shape our understanding of conflict, strategy, and human nature. In the story of Troy's fall, we see reflected all the complexity of human civilization. its achievements and failures, its nobility and cruelty, its wisdom and folly. The horse that stood for one night in Troy's square has become immortal, a testament to the power of storytelling to preserve and transmit the deepest truths about the human condition across the centuries and into the future.